At the Game Awards last year, in December, Warlock was revealed. This game is an upcoming third-person action-adventure set to release in 2027 and takes place in a dark fantasy world inspired by Dungeons and Dragons. You play as this character Katari, a veteran warrior who forms a pact to wield forbidden magic in order to survive a hostile and unsettling world. Based on the information currently available, magic appears to play a rather significant role in both the combat and exploration, although the full scope of these systems have yet to be shown. Rather than positioning itself clearly as a traditional role-playing game, Warlock currently presents itself as a more action-oriented experience. The available material suggests a focus on real-time combat where melee and magic are combined directly under the player's control. At the same time, the developers describe spells as tools that interact with the environment, potentially unlocking paths, secrets, or alternate ways of approaching challenges that you come across in your gameplay. And how extensive or systemic these interactions remains to be seen. Now, Warlock is being developed by a studio named Invoke Studios, and this studio is a relatively young studio with a limited release history. So far, the studio has released 2 games, with Warlock being its third announced project. Their most notable previous title is a game called Dungeons and Dragons Dark Alliance, which received a rather mixed reaction from critics and a notably low score from players. And if we just take a look at it here, we have here the Metacritic score of it, and from the critics, we see that it landed at a review of 53 and a notably lower review score from the users, a 3.1, which roughly translates to around the 30s area. Now, that background provides actually a rather useful context for this, but it is at the same time not a definitive indicator of what Warlock will ultimately end up delivering. While Dungeons and Dragons Dark Alliance faced criticism related to the combat feel or technical polish, as well as the repetition and overall execution, these shortcomings were largely tied to how systems were implemented. At the same time, the project did demonstrate that the studio has hands-on experience working within a major fantasy IP and building real-time action-oriented combat systems at scales as well. Now, this is interesting because Warlock appears to operate in a similar design space, but with a clearer focus and potentially more controlled scope. If Invoke Studios has taken lessons from its earlier release titles, particularly around the combat responsiveness, encounter variety, and overall cohesion, Warlock could represent a more refined application of ideas from the studio that they have already explored before. Now, with that being said, until more gameplay has been revealed, it remains an open question, really, whether or not these lessons have translated into an actual improvement or whether similar issues will resurface. The studio is being led by a CEO with prior experience at Ubisoft, which suggests familiarity with large-scale production and large-scale environments as well. The CEO in question is Jeff Haddam, and during his time at Ubisoft from early 2000s until late 2006, he moved around in different roles from lead level design to lead designer and even managed creative director. He was a part of the dev team making Far Cry 2005, which I imagine lots of people know. Listed titles include Splinter Cell Conviction from 2010 and Splinter Cell Double Agent from 2006, and lastly a game called Batman Rise of Sin Tzu. How much of that experience translated into design decisions or production quality at Invoke Studios is yet to be seen, but it does indicate that the studio is not operating without any industry background. Warlock clearly draws inspiration from the Dungeons and Dragons, as it is being marketed as part of this whole franchise, though not in the same way as classic RPG adaptations. And so far, there hasn't been any party management indications or turn-based combat or even systems closely mirroring tabletop mechanics. Instead, the D&D influence appears to be expressed primarily through the tone, world building, the magic, and in general the creature design. This does place Warlock in a different category than games such as the Baldur's Gate trilogy or whatever you want to call it, which are built around top-down perspectives. There's deep systemic complexity and the player choice through dialogue. Warlock doesn't appear to be targeting that design philosophy or space, and any comparison mainly serves to clarify what the game is not rather than what it is trying to replicate. And based on currently available footage and descriptions, combat sounds like a central part of Warlock's identity. The game seems to emphasize direct, real-time engagement with magic and with melee used alongside each other rather than a separate system. Now that said, the actual depth and variety and long-term sustainability of combat cannot be evaluated until more gameplay has been revealed. One open question though is whether Warlock will lean primarily on moment-to-moment action or whether it will introduce a deeper progression systems over time. And the framing of magic as something that affects both combat and exploration suggests an ambition to move beyond the pure action, but it's not yet clear how far that ambition really extends in practice. From a broader perspective, Warlock appears to sit between exploration and exploitation, and what I mean by that is a common theory among organizations is ambidexterity of organizations, whether to continue in the same path that you've already done before with exploitation, and by continuously improving what you already know, you gain the expertise of that product or service that you want to deliver to the end user. And by taking another approach, you can explore the exploration part of it and looking at new mechanics, new worlds, or new technologies that you could implement. With this, the studio may be attempting to explore new ideas such as the magic-driven interaction while relying on familiar foundations like the third-person action combat. And striking a balance between these two approaches will likely be important, but too much experimentation or too much focus on what is already known could lead to unfocused systems. From that perspective, Warlock is not the first project where experimentations depend on whether a relatively low profile studio can turn a focused vision into something that resonates more broadly. The game industry has seen multiple cases where studios that were largely unknown outside smaller circles managed to make a breakthrough, not because they reinvented everything, but because they executed a clear idea well and stayed within a scope that they could control. In those cases, success was less about pedigree and more about coherence and understanding what the game needed to be, and just as importantly, what it did not have to be and what it didn't want to offer the player. What I mean by this is there are actually examples of studios with a limited prior experience delivering successful fantasy titles, and a obvious example of this is the Hogwarts Legacy team developed by Avalanche Software, and they demonstrated that a studio without a long RPG track record could still achieve strong reception within a scope and focus fully aligned. Now, this comparison does not guarantee anything for Warlock really, but it does suggest that outcomes are not predetermined by the studio history all on its own. Warlock does represent an opportunity for Invoke Studio to demonstrate growth and clarity of vision, particularly in how the combat and exploration come together. At this stage, Warlock is best approached with a cautious optimism. The concept is clearly defined at a high level. Dungeons & Dragons inspiration provides a strong thematic foundation, and the action-focused framing is consistent across the available material, but whether those elements translate into a polished and engaging experience is something that can only be assessed closer to its release. Now, with that being said, I hope that you find this video interesting. Now, as I'm recording this, there hasn't really been much shown of the game apart from the aforementioned trailer during the Game Awards show, and I wanted to take this video in a different approach, more of a speculative type of videos, and sort of offer my thoughts on what we can expect from this game, from this relatively unknown studio. I hope you found it interesting. I hope that you are willing to share your thoughts on this game, what some of the things that you might worry about this game being, if it's going to be a microtransaction hell or if there are other parts that you may find interesting instead. That's about it. Take care, everyone.